Yes, the dominant narrative is that, budgetary negligence was the cause of the crisis, and the media have colluded in this narrative because nobody has challenged the assertion that it was budgetary negligence that caused the crisis. So I think in terms of, where's the fulcrum and where is the narrative going to change? Well, I suppose if you look at public participation, I think it will come from, as Sean mentioned, the crisis of legitimacy, because the European Union is suffering from a crisis of legitimacy amongst citizens of the European Union, citizens of countries, particularly countries who were within bailout programs, because they are feeling the brunt of cumulative years of the imposition of austerity measures year after year after year, yet the benefits of these austerity measures are essentially going to repay parts of the financial sector. And in a sense, you have these measures now being embedded into national budgetary processes through European treaties. So I think perhaps the point will come in terms of changing the narrative is when the citizens will have their say, and maybe the media might, not all media here, I'm aware that Mick is here chairing, but a lot of the mainstream media does not challenge the narrative, or it does not ask the difficult questions. And I think there is a space there for the media to start asking some difficult questions of public representatives and European representatives, and to also consider what alternatives that are being advocated and articulated out there but are not necessarily receiving much coverage in the public discourse, because there are people articulating alternatives and these should be discussed.
There's a real issue here that European leaders in the stronger countries need to take a bit of responsibility for as well. I think there is something profoundly problematic about somebody like Angela Merkel arguing that austerity was necessary because of the budgetary negligence of countries over many years, when that is simply untrue, with the exception of Greece. And also she emphasised, and I quote, the extreme debt of certain countries accumulated over many years, like as we showed earlier on in the table, the chart that Michelle showed, that's simply untrue as well. Now, from that starting point, everything else flows in that analysis. And I find it very interesting when when on continental Europe trying to get engagement with this, people simply won't look at the evidence. People dismiss it as special pleading. They will not engage, and it's very interesting that the people who don't want to engage are the people who are benefiting. So you ask a question then about who decides these kinds of things and who benefits from them and who pays, and the decisions are being made by pretty powerful players, and they're the ones who benefit, and taxpayers in peripheral countries like Ireland pay. But it's all based on a false analysis, and it's all promulgated and promoted by a false narrative. Now, you can draw your own conclusions from that. I don't believe that that's a complete series of accidents. I believe that people are very clear about where their own benefits and their own gains lie, and they argue accordingly.
Yes, we do have a progressive income tax system if you look at it on its own, but there are also a lot of space, especially within the Irish system, for people to avail of tax breaks, for example, on their pensions and various other measures. So even though the income tax system is progressive, the higher your income is, the more likely you are to avail of the tax breaks. And if you just take the pension tax break, 80% of that goes to the top 20% of the population, the top 20% of earners. And what we would always advocate is that government evaluates how much these tax breaks and tax expenditure are actually costing the state, because they're a cost to the state because it's tax forgone. Secondly, if you look at our tax system as a whole and our tax base, Sean mentioned how low it was. I mean, one simple thing that government could do that we advocate in our budget choices document was to introduce a minimum effective corporate tax rate. Our headline rate is 12.5%, but in reality, There are a lot of companies, particularly large multinationals, who don't pay anything near 12.5%, but the majority of small and medium enterprises do. So if you introduced a minimum effective corporate tax rate of just 6%, that would go some way towards making broadening our tax base, but making our tax system more equitable. But I mean, we have a long way to go. And just saying that we have the most progressive tax system in the OECD actually ignores all the other factors that come to play when you consider your tax system, the tax expenditures available to people, the effective tax rates then for people. And I suppose just to point out, the government decided not to apply the higher rate of the universal social charge to those earning over €100,000, which I suppose says a lot about the choices we make in this country, while at the same time deciding to cut social services, of which the heaviest users are families with young children, those on low income, those with disabilities.
There's an extraordinary amount of work has actually been done on this, even here in Ireland. And we ourselves have done some work around alternative indicators. The National Economic and Social Council has done a very good piece of work and published it on measuring progress and how it should be measured and so on, and how GDP is just one component of it. In framing it, I think a couple of things. One is that we would always say that economic and social and environmental elements need to be put together, because there are three different dimensions, but if you miss one of either you miss the economic or the environmental or the social dimensions, then you're missing an essential component of what's required to sort of build a sustainable or viable future. And the other thing I suppose we would say is that we've been for years arguing that one of the ways that we could start this process is by developing shadow national accounts that several other countries have developed, many other countries have, which is, okay, we keep our standard national accounts, but let's create another set of national accounts that puts all those ones that are there in place, but starts putting minuses in. If you have a natural disaster, at the moment, if you have a natural disaster, for example, if there's a huge oil spillage outside in Dublin Bay and the whole place is destroyed and it has to be cleaned up and it costs millions and millions to clean it up, all of that is adding to GDP, adding to it. Now, we're sort of saying maybe we should have an alternative set of national accounts, the shadow set, that actually sees that as a minus and puts it in. Likewise, if you're using natural resources and that aren't going to be the finite resources that you've only so much of, then they should be minuses as well. But on the other side, we would add in, for example, in there, things that aren't counted at all, like unpaid work. There's mountains of unpaid work done, without which the society would not survive, essential for it to be glued together, hold it together, and yet it's not counted at all. And because it isn't counted in the GDP, it isn't valued. Because it isn't counted, it doesn't count. And if you doubt that, as I often say, like, ask any woman, because an enormous amount of caring work and development work and work in the community is done by women on an unpaid basis, and yet it's not valued, and we don't count it in our numbers. Shadow national accounts will give us the capacity to put all that stuff together in an alter and give us at least the beginnings of a way of starting towards putting indicators, alternative indicators in place. Thanks. I suppose we would have put both of them under, well, certainly the enterprise one under macroeconomic sustainability. Without enterprise, we don't think that's going to happen. But if maybe some of these things need to be highlighted out on their own anyway. We were simply giving examples of the various things. The other piece of the labour market, for all sorts of reasons, that's under the social side as the infrastructure, but also under the economic side. And without it being put in place and addressed and given priority, we'd accept totally that we won't be recovering anytime soon. So I'd buy both of those. I mean, as I say, we think we would consider them already integrated. We've been struggling to get this truth across because it's very quite interesting. Page 11 of the paper, of the book, that original paper, is not the first place that particular study was cited. It was cited on a couple of occasions in analysis of the budget by the Department of Finance published as part of the budget documentation, for example. Now, in our response to that budget, when it was first done, we actually cited the rest of the study. The rest of the study shows that there's quite an amount of stuff left out that wasn't actually included. What we have been making 2 points. One is that when you add in the cumulative impact of all of the various hits that have been taken over a period of years, that's an important issue. And secondly, that it's important to measure the hits being taken against the capacity that the people taking the hits already have or had at the time of the beginning. So for example, when it started, for example, if you're contrast the position of somebody who's on social welfare of €188 a week and somebody who's a millionaire. The millionaire takes a 10% cut, hit, whatever. Well, that means they have 900 grand. The person that's on the welfare is already by definition €20 below the poverty line to start with, and then loses some money, but on top of that loses all sorts of other supports in the system, whether that has to do with health, school, transport systems, fuel, telephones, and a whole lot of other stuff depending on your age and all the various other hits that particular groups have taken. Those people, that accumulation of hits actually pushes those people over the edge. And that's our contention. And the kind of issue of trying to, a lot of that is not caught in the percentage issue, and it's not and because a lot of the stuff isn't included in those percentages sometimes. But also a lot of it is not caught by something like the Gini coefficient either, because in actual fact you need to put into place some kind of analysis that shows how close to the cliff people are. If you are standing 1 yard from the edge of a sheer cliff and another person is standing a kilometre away from the cliff, the person who's a kilometre away can move a half a kilometre towards the cliff and still be a long way away, but the person who's simply a metre from the cliff edge takes 1.5 meters and is dead. Now that's the bottom line. So those kinds of issues aren't taken in. And I was very happy to hear Tim Callan say this morning that they're doing more detailed analysis in the SRI, because I certainly would like to see the results of that.
There is hope, and there are alternatives available, and they are being articulated, and slowly but surely the narrative will change, because people will see that the policy paths we're currently following are not working. And yes, it takes time, it takes a huge amount of time for such a shift to take place, but you can see that very, very slowly it is taking place, and people look around them and they see, the lives that people are living. It's not allowing them to live life with dignity. They don't have access to the requisite services. They're not participating in society as they should be. They're not being valued as they should be. Their well-being is not being valued. But more and more and more, you're hearing people articulating this, and they're articulating alternatives to the economic policies that we're currently following. And so hope is being articulated, and yes, it is a very slow process, but I think slowly but surely the narrative will change, and there will have to be a complete change at both the European level and the national level in terms of what policies we follow, and in terms of what type of country we actually want to live in, and what services we expect, and what services we are willing to pay for, and that everybody needs to be included in that process and in that discussion, and everybody's opinion should be valued equally.